The Syrian conflict is a complicated mess. It started in 2011. Protests erupted against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. These protests were brutally suppressed. The situation quickly spiraled into a full-blown civil war. The conflict has drawn in global superpowers. The United States, Russia, and others have been pulled into the fray. This begs a terrifying question. Could this chaos ignite World War III? The Syrian conflict is a tangled web of alliances, interests, and ideologies. It's a proxy war, where bigger players use smaller factions to fight their battles. This makes the situation incredibly volatile. Any misstep, any miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. This isn't just a regional issue. The Syrian conflict has sent shockwaves across the globe. The refugee crisis, the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, and the constant threat of escalation all have global implications. We ignore this conflict at our peril. We need to talk about Syria. We need to understand the stakes. And most importantly, we need to demand a peaceful resolution. Syria in 2011 was ripe for unrest. The Arab Spring was in full swing. People across the region were rising up against their oppressive rulers. Syrians, inspired by their neighbors, took to the streets. They demanded democracy. They demanded an end to corruption. They demanded Bashar al-Assad's resignation. Assad's response was swift and brutal. He unleashed his security forces upon the protesters. Peaceful demonstrations were met with live ammunition. Hundreds were killed, thousands were arrested and tortured. The situation escalated rapidly. What began as peaceful protests transformed into armed rebellion. As the violence escalated, the conflict became increasingly complex. Different groups with different ideologies and goals emerged. The Free Syrian Army, a loose coalition of defectors from Assad's military, emerged to fight for democracy. Islamist groups, some with ties to al-Qaeda, saw an opportunity to seize power. Kurdish groups in the north sought autonomy. Syria was no longer a country at war with itself, but a battleground for a multitude of factions. The Syrian conflict is a humanitarian catastrophe. Millions have been displaced. Entire cities have been reduced to rubble. The international community has struggled to find a solution, and the Syrian people continue to suffer. The Syrian conflict is a tangled web of alliances and rivalries. It's like a bad reality TV show, but with higher stakes, like the end of the world as we know it. On one side, we have Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president who seems determined to cling to power no matter the cost. He's backed by Russia, which sees Syria as a key strategic asset in the Middle East. Iran, another major player in the region, also supports Assad. They share his goal of pushing back against Western influence. On the other side, we have the Syrian opposition, a fractured group of rebels fighting to overthrow Assad. The U.S. has provided limited support to some rebel groups, but their involvement has been cautious and often contradictory. Then there are the Kurds, a non-Arab ethnic group concentrated in northern Syria. They've been fighting for autonomy for decades, and the chaos of the civil war has given them an opportunity to advance their cause. Turkey, however, sees the Kurds as a major threat. They've launched military operations in Syria to push back against Kurdish gains. To make things even more complicated, the Syrian conflict has become a breeding ground for terrorist groups like ISIS. These groups exploit the chaos to recruit fighters and launch attacks. The fight against ISIS has further drawn in international actors, creating a complex web of overlapping and often conflicting interests. It's a mess, basically. And it's a mess with the potential to explode into something far, far worse. So how did a civil war in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map become a global crisis? The answer, in a word, is spillover. The Syrian conflict has consequences far beyond its borders. Millions of refugees have fled the fighting, seeking safety in neighboring countries and Europe. This has strained resources and fueled political tensions. Remember the Brexit vote? Yeah, the Syrian refugee crisis played a part in that. The conflict has also exacerbated regional instability. It's fueled sectarian tensions between Sunni and Shia Muslims, further destabilizing an already volatile region. The rise of ISIS, which declared a caliphate in parts of Syria and Iraq, demonstrated the potential for the conflict to spawn transnational terrorist threats. Suddenly, what seemed like a distant conflict hit close to home for many around the world. But perhaps the most alarming aspect of the Syrian conflict is the risk of direct confrontation between major powers. The US and Russia, despite being on opposing sides, have established deconfliction mechanisms to avoid accidental clashes between their forces operating in Syria. But these mechanisms are only as good as the willingness of both sides to abide by them. And in the heat of battle, miscalculations and accidents can happen. The Syrian conflict is a powder keg. The question isn't if it will explode, but when and how. And when it does, the consequences will be felt around the world.